Okay? All right. Okay. Oh, I can't see out of these, but that's right. All right. Hi, everybody. I really can't see you with these glasses, but my name is Ann Kennedy. I'm a member of the board of Tales of Cape Cod. Before we get going, I want to say that next week's guest is Dr. Robert Martello. Dr. Martello gave a scheduled talk last year. It was excellent. It was so good. But unfortunately, there was a tornado watch that night, so there was like half of this audience. And not even half. It was like one section. It was embarrassing. But because of that tornado warning, I'm sure that was the reason. And the talk was so excellent that we invited him back this year. So he will talk about Paul Revere, the patriot, but also Paul Revere, the entrepreneur, who helped lead a reluctant nation into the industrial age. So you will note in your program brochures that Ben Shattuck was originally scheduled for tonight. This is not Ben Shattuck. This is cuter than Ben Shattuck. No. He was originally scheduled for tonight, but because of a scheduling conflict on Mr. Shattuck's part, he begged to switch dates, and our featured speaker this evening, Vincent Miles, graciously obliged. So if you're here for Ben, I apologize, but please do stay because you won't be disappointed. Vincent is one of our favorites. So tonight's program is sponsored by Mr. and Mrs. Anonymous and John and Eliza Lewis. And I'd also like to thank our baker, Sue Schwager. Okay, now, born and raised in Liverpool, England, Vincent Miles attended St. Joseph College, Upholland, the Catholic minor seminary for the Archdiocese of Liverpool. He changed direction at age 18, leaving the seminary to train as a scientist, and that's a subject of one of his books. He earned degrees in biochemistry and a PhD in biochemical embryology from University College in London. After a short stint in a government lab as a forensic scientist, he joined the emerging biotechnology industry, progressing over time to senior positions in research, development, and marketing. Part of this progression, lucky for us, led him to move to America, where he has lived since 1984. In 2007, he joined a life science venture capital firm in Boston, where he leads and manages investment in young privately held biotech companies. Vincent has a self-acknowledged passion for history, especially maritime history. In 2003, Vincent was elected as Associate Fellow of the Royal Historical Society in recognition of his published books, such as Lost Hero, about a Cape Cod sea captain named Asa Eldridge, which I'm going to venture to say might creep into tonight's talk. Yeah. So he has been a frequent speaker at the Historical Society of Old Yarmouth, as well as Tales of Cape Cod, and I'm very pleased to introduce our friend Vincent Miles.
I decided to mic up tonight. I want to feel like Justin Timberlake. Don't think it's going to happen. It's actually because I like to turn around and point. Oh, there we are. Okay. So my thanks to Anne and Tales of Cape Cod to invite me back to speak, and to all of you for coming out on a beautiful summer evening. If you've been watching the screen for the last few minutes, what you're actually seeing scrolling across here are the first 4 steamships that were purpose-built to cross the Atlantic. And they've been going across in the order in which they made their first crossings. But I should say, by way of explanation, when I talked about early ocean liners, that was really shorthand for early ocean steamship liners. There were actually sailing ship liners for about 20 years before the steamships came along. So I thought I'd start by, can you hear me? Oh, well. Sorry about So I'll try and use this microphone and not turn away too much. So setting the scene. Okay, I'll use that. Thanks. So setting the scene. Scheduled sailings across the Atlantic first began in 1818, and the advertisement in the New York Herald, which announced them, I'll show you something about that here. So the most important thing, actually, is that graphic on the top, because what that signified was the 4 ships shown down at the bottom were going to operate as a line. Up until this point, ships operated independently of each other. Owners never cooperated, and so most ships would make one trip every year to the UK, for example, if they were US ships. They go once a year in the spring, once a year in the fall, stay in port or winter, when the Atlantic is a very treacherous place, and there would be no fixed sailing time for them. So they would only sail once their holds were full, which is a little bit frustrating if you're trying to run a business. So the gentlemen who owned these 4 ships decided to do something completely different. They were going to operate them as a line, one following after the other on a regular basis. That, by the way, is they're called liners, which never really hit me when I was young, but that's why they're called liners. They were also called packets. The only other vessels that sailed on a schedule at this time were mail boats, and they carried packets of mail. So anything that sailed on a schedule became known as a packet. So those are important terminologies to define, because I'll keep using them throughout the presentation. So the important thing here is that they specified and committed that every month of the year, including the winter, they would sail on a pre-scheduled date, one ship from New York to Liverpool, another one from Liverpool to New York. And they stuck to that promise. Now, by 1830s, this caught on so well, this concept of scheduled sailing, there were multiple packet lines sailing between the US and Europe. Sorry. And this led to a complete dominance of transatlantic trade by the US merchants. The average crossing times, though, were not particularly impressive. So you're used to getting across the Atlantic in about 5 hours. Well, if you were sailing eastbound, it would take 22 days. If you were coming back in the opposite direction, it would take 33. So you may be wondering why there was such a discrepancy between one direction and the other. And that was all to do with currents and winds. And they're going to play an important part in the rest of the presentation here. So when you were sailing east, you were sailing with the Gulf Stream, warm water coming up from the Gulf of Mexico that went up the US coast and then crossed over, became the North Atlantic Current and went just north of Scotland. You were also normally aided by prevailing winds. Most of the time, the winds prevail from the west. Of course, if you were coming back in the opposite direction, you were fighting the current and you were fighting the wind. There's another current I should mention, because it's going to play a major role in what you hear coming up, and it's called the Labrador Current. It comes down from the Arctic, particularly in the spring and the summer, and as you can see from the blue, it's a cold current. So what happens when this cold current meets the warm current coming up from the Gulf? The current from the Gulf has warm, moist air above it, and as it meets the cold current coming down from the Arctic, what you get is fog. And that's going to feature very prominently in what you hear for the rest of the evening. Now, the other thing that comes with that current for quite a bit of the year are icebergs. So they're coming down as glaciers calve in the spring. So it may not surprise you to learn that the spot where that red star just appeared is where the Titanic sank. In 1912, these currents were a little bit further down than they normally are, and that's where the Titanic hit an iceberg in fog. So if we zoom in on the coastline where this fog is occurring on a regular basis, you can see that it's actually very treacherous. So it's the coastline of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And if I zoom in on the area boxed there and get to a higher contrast, you'll see that it's a very craggy, rocky coastline. And in addition to the craggy, rocky coastline that you can see, there were many slabs that were just below the surface and very easy to run into, particularly in fog. And for that reason, it was the norm, and I think it was actually required for passenger vessels to take on a local pilot when sailing through this area, because that pilot would know where all the hidden rocks and dangers were. And again, that will come to feature in the presentation. So you may be wondering why, in the 1830s, which is where I'm talking about now, there were no transatlantic steamships yet. Steamers had first appeared in the early 1800s, and they were common on rivers and for short-haul sea crossings, like, for example, going between England and Ireland. There were quite a number of steamers that would also be going up and down the coast of the US and going up the coast, down the coast of England and Scotland, for example. But there had been a few which had come all the way across the Atlantic, but only under particular circumstances. So the first limitation was they only used steam as auxiliary power when the winds were too light to keep them moving. And the second thing is people hadn't yet figured out how to condense the water in the boilers. So they were using seawater, which of course scaled up the boilers. So every now and again they just have to stop the engines anyway to descale the boilers. So this was not working out too well. But the single biggest reason there were none coming was because of the experts. And the experts argued steam engines were not especially efficient at this time, and they did use lots of coal. So the experts argued that it would be impossible for a ship to carry enough coal inside of its hold to steam all the way across the Atlantic. It would run out of fuel halfway across the Atlantic, and nobody wanted to do that. And that's the situation that prevailed in 1833, when this ship, which represented the state of the art at the time, a packet ship called the Europe, made its first trip across the Atlantic under wind power in 1833. And there's one thing I want to mention in relation to this. You'll see it's classified as 618 tons. When they use the word tons, they weren't referring to the weight of the ship or the amount of water it displaced. That was the official estimate by the customs of the cargo capacity of that ship, because that estimate was used to calculate import duties and also port fees. So bear that in mind every time you hear me use the word tons. So the story about steamships begins in 1833 with this strange-looking gentleman. His name was Junius Smith. He's an American lawyer. He lives in London, where he married a Brit. And he's also become an entrepreneur. He starts various businesses. And in 1832, he chartered a bark, which is a type of ship worth, it's like a ship only it has a fore and aft sail at the back, to go on a business trip to New York. And that crossing from from London to New York took him 54 days. So that gave him plenty of time to get all steamed up, if you give the expression, about how long it was taking. And he spent a lot of time thinking about how this could be improved, and of course he concluded that it should be done with steamships. So when he arrived in New York, he started pitching the idea of a transatlantic steamship line. Well, that idea did not catch on to begin with, but in 1835, which is a few years later, he had enough enthusiasm from potential investors to found the British and American Steam Navigation Company, which I will call the B&A for short. And he proposed that this would operate between London and New York. In 1836, after another year, he'd finally raised enough money to get started on building steamships. So the first one he built, he called it the Royal Victoria, because a certain young lady at this time was the heir to the throne, but not yet on the throne. And by the following year, her father had died. Victoria was now the Queen, and he renamed this ship the British Queen. But even as he was building this ship, there was already competition that had got ahead of him. And that came in the form of a company called the Great Western Steamship Company, which I'll call the GWSC because it's easier to say. So Parliament had just approved the building of a railway line between London and Bristol. And the gentleman on the right over there, his name is Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He was one of the most foremost engineers of the 19th century. And almost in jest, he said to his colleagues, well, why don't we build a steamship? And then we can go all the way, not only from London to Bristol, but London to New York. Well, he was joking, but people took him seriously. And this GWSC was incorporated shortly afterwards and actually beat the B&A to placing its order for its first ship, which was, of course, called, the Great Western. So in terms of size, remember that packet ship I showed you? This was about twice the size in terms of tons, but it needed to be bigger because it needed to carry a lot of coal. And note the 450 horsepower. I don't know, I've tried to figure out how exactly a 19th century horsepower translates to a 21st century horsepower, but I think they're similar enough to give you the idea. The British Queen looked like this. Sorry, we missed that one. And as you'll notice, these were essentially sailing ships that they dropped an engine and paddle wheels into. They were not very sophisticated at all. And give you a sense of comparison to modern objects, each of these ships was about the same length as a jumbo jet, a 747. But they had less power than a high-end pickup truck, if the horsepowers are equivalent. So how would you fancy sailing across the Atlantic in a ship about as long as a jumbo jet with a pickup engine driving it? That's what people were doing. So if we've talked now about the routes, as I mentioned earlier, and it's where the packet ship trade started, the premium route was between New York and Liverpool. And the reason for that was that just inland from Liverpool was the area where the Industrial Revolution started for the whole world, period. And in particular, there were textile mills just inland. So if an American ship arrived in Liverpool with a cargo of cotton, it could sell that for a very good price and use the proceeds to buy stuff to take back that it could sell for a good price, like those finished textiles, or steel from Sheffield, which is just over there, or pottery from Stoke-on-Trent, or factory goods from Birmingham. So a captain was always guaranteed of a good cargo to take whole if he sailed to Liverpool. So where were the routes of these two new steamship companies? Well, Junius Smith was sailing from London, which is great if you're trading with continental Europe. It's a little bit awkward, though, if you're sailing to America, because you have to come around like here. And in fact, most ships that originated in London would make a stop on the south coast, Southampton or Portsmouth, for example, because a lot of people found it more convenient to go there than to wait to go all the way around the corner. The GWSC was sailing from Bristol, which was pretty remote from any of the industrialized areas, but once this railroad was built between London and Bristol, would hope to benefit from the cargoes that were coming into London from the continent. So these two companies were now in a race to be first across the Atlantic. And in January of 1838, the Great Western Steamship Company advertised that its ship was going to sail from Bristol to New York in April. This was bad news for the B&A because the British Queen was nowhere near ready. But they came up with an answer. They went and chartered a short-haul steamer whose job normally was to shuttle between England and Ireland, called the Sirius. It was about half the size of the other ships that we've been looking at, 700 tons, 300 horsepower. So it needed to get a leg up if it was going to have any chance of getting to New York before the Great Western. Well, it left Cork 3 days before before the Great Western was due to leave Bristol, and that gave it two advantages. One is, of course, that Cork is 350 miles closer to New York than Bristol is, and the other is it had a 3-day head start. So what happened? Well, both steamers arrived in New York on the same day. The Sirius arrived about 12 hours early in the morning, and so they could claim, the B&A could claim to have made the first Atlantic crossing by a steamship. But the Great Western, which arrived 12 hours later, could claim the fastest ever crossing of the Atlantic in that direction, 15 days from Bristol to New York, which, to remind you about the numbers I gave you at the beginning, was less than half of the 33 days that was average for a sailing packet. Now, imitation is the best form of flattery, they say, the sincerest form. And so another company had been inspired by the doings of the B&A and the Great Western. And in June, this advertisement appeared in the Liverpool Mercury. The date is June the 8th, which is only 2 months after those two ships headed off for New York. And it was a company that was going to call itself the Transatlantic Steamships Company that was copying the trick the B&A had used. They were taking a short-haul steamer called the Royal William, which was operated by the City of Dublin Steamship Company. So it was going to and from between England and Ireland. Smaller than the Sirius. Most importantly, though, this was the first one that was going to sail directly from Liverpool to New York. Now, by itself, such a small steamer was not going to be a threat to the other two companies, but this company had another trick up its sleeve too. There was a Liverpool businessman, actually the former mayor of the city, who had been thinking about going into the transatlantic trade himself, and he had started building this ship that was nearly complete at this time, called appropriately the Liverpool. And so this new company had arranged to buy this steamship almost complete from this guy, Sir James Tobin, and in October it was actually ready to make its first voyage across the Atlantic. So you've now gone from no steamships going across the Atlantic to 3 different companies operating steamships across the Atlantic. And in November of 1838, the government did something that would soon make it 4. So the previous year, there had been 2 armed rebellions in Canada. And what they showed up was how hard it was for the Canadian provincial government, which, by the way, it was still a colony of England at this time, of Britain at this time, to communicate with the government back in Westminster. What should we do about this rebellion? What changes should we make? How are we going to meet the grievances of these people? Well, doing that by mail when it was taking 2 months to exchange was very inefficient. So in 1838, local bigwigs from Canada sailed to England to demand better service, which of course implied steamships. And the British government was very receptive to this because they had been very worried for some time about the complete dominance of American packet ships in carrying goods and services across the Atlantic, but in particular mail. A lot of the official mail was going on the American packet ships, which obviously was a security risk. So very quickly thereafter, the Admiralty, which is in charge of the Royal Navy, solicited bids for civilian transatlantic mail service. And they specified they needed to be done by steamships with at least 300 horsepower. So the Great Western Company, of course, submitted a bid. So did the St. George's Company, which was the owner of the Sirius. Neither of them met the requirements. The one that did was a person whose photograph you may not recognize, but whose name you probably do. He was Samuel Cunard. And he was a successful businessman in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And among the many businesses he operated was a fleet of ships, and then within that fleet of ships, he also operated a mail service between Halifax down to Bermuda and back. So he was highly qualified in terms of experience to actually give a good reply to the Admiralty about their solicitation. What he proposed was to build multiple identical ships, and he was awarded a contract. He was the winner. His contract was awarded in 1839 to sail from Liverpool to Boston via Halifax in Nova Scotia. So there's that route. There we have Halifax. The terminus was Boston. Halifax was obviously the whole point of the exercise from the government's point of view. That would speed up the mail service. Boston was the second choice. Originally, the Admiralty had wanted the service to go to New York, but when they saw the price that Cunard was going to charge for doing that, they cut the cost a little bit by going to Boston instead of New York. Of course, Boston always loved getting a victory over New York, so they were very pleased about that. In fact, there was a big party thrown when the first ship arrived. So what Cunard did next distinguished him from the other companies I've talked about so far. They all went to local builders and local designers to try and get their ships built. But Cunard, on the basis of having run a fleet, knew that you had to go to the best. And the best were all up in Glasgow. So most of the coastal steamers operating on the British coast were being built in Glasgow on the River Clyde, where you had good designers for the ships and for the engines that would go in them. So he went up there, he cut a deal with some of the people up there, and persuaded some of the people who operated those coastal steamer lines to come and join him too. So he started right from the best with the best ships and the most experienced operators. His service began on July the 4th in 1840, a date which has significance in the US. So maybe he was just poking their eye a little bit by sending the first ship called the Britannia. And the Britannia was actually slightly smaller than the Great Western, but the same sort of ballpark. And over the next 10 years, he established a reputation for safety and reliability year-round, all through the winter as well, that was bar none. He was the best. So what were his competitors up to? How were they responding to this? Well, the answer is they were all blowing it one way or another. So the Great Western Steamship Company, their first ship continued to sail steadily, but they didn't have a second ship for a long time afterwards. So that ship had to be a workhorse all during the summer, and then spent all winter getting maintenance to get her back up so she was ready to do it again the following summer. So she did not sail in winter. The next ship they built, called the Great Britain, was a fiasco, which I'll describe in a minute. How about the B&A? Well, the Sirius was really just built to go across the Irish Sea and not really suitable for crossing the Atlantic. She only made one more round trip, and the British Queen finally entered service in 1839, and despite the great hopes of Junior Smith, turned out to be slow, significantly slower than the Great Western. And their next ship was not just a fiasco, it was a disaster, as I'll describe shortly. The third company, the Transatlantic Steamship Company, had started off well by not only buying that ship I told you that was almost complete, by ordering a second steamer, a little bit bigger than that one. And with the Royal William, the coastal steamer they'd borrowed, and that steamship they bought, they actually had a decent record for the first year and a half of their operation. But the Liverpool, coming back from the US, ran into a terrible storm, took on some damage, turned out to be unsuitable in her design to deal with a storm like that. So when she did finally get home, they decided to put her in dry dock and do a complete refit. And while she was there, they sold the company to the P&O, Pacific and Oriental, a shipping line that was still in existence fairly recently, may still be as far as I know. So they were out of business. So we're now down just to the GWSC and the B&A to compete with Cunard. So what was that fiasco I told about with the Great Britain? Well, they went from a ship that was about 1,400 tons to one that was 3,443, a huge jump in size, 1,000 horsepower instead of 450, 320 foot long, etc. The Bristol newspaper described her as having more new and experimental technology than any vessel that had ever been built. And that turned out to be a problem. One of the innovations that was claimed for her was she was the first propeller-driven ship with an iron hull. That turns out not to be true, but that was the claim made for her. I'll tell you about the one that really was in a few minutes. The construction began in 1840. Everything was experimental. It took 3 years until she was launched. And then at this point, steamers were actually launched without the machinery in place. So this was a screw propeller, but the engine and the propellers were not in yet. And essentially, all the luxury quarters were not fitted out yet, too. That was fairly normal. Ships were launched about a year before they actually went out to sea for the first voyage. This lithograph celebrates the launch. As you can see, it was a huge public event. But just to show you that really smart people can also be really stupid at times, Brunel had failed to realize, with some modifications he went, as the building went along, she was too wide to get out of the gate of the dock in which she'd been built. So the GWSC spent 9 months haggling with the dock company about who was going to pay to have the exit modified so the ship could get out. And in the end, Parliament had to intervene. But eventually, she did get out, having spent the whole of 1844 trapped in that dock. Remember, they're bleeding money while all this is happening. Then she finally made her maiden, but this was taken, a photograph taken of her while she was trapped in the dock. This is believed to be the first photograph ever taken of a ship. She got out of the dock and she made her maiden voyage the following year in 1845. Next year, she strands on a beach in Northern Ireland because the captain mistook which lighthouse he'd just seen, and so grounded on a beach. It was such a soft landing that all the passengers elected to stay on board and sleep in their comfortable beds until help could arrive the next morning. There was no damage to the ship. She just had to be refloated. Well, that took a year to figure out how to refloat this ship. So she finally was refloated in 1847, and the cost bankrupted the GWSC. So now the Transatlantic Steamship Company and the GWSC are out of business. That just leaves Cunard and the B&A. And by the way, amazingly enough, the SS Great Britain is the only one of the ships you'll hear anybody talk about from this era that still survived. She had a career about 100 years long, ended up about the last half of that just as a storage hulk for coal off the Falklands Island. She was abandoned in a cove in 1935. A rich Bristolian decided to bring her back to Bristol in 1970 on a massive barge, got money from the National Lottery. She was completely restored. So if you ever go to Bristol, which I haven't been, you can see her in her original pristine condition. How about the B&A and their ship, the next ship, the President? So this was commissioned in 1838, which is before the British Queen was sailing, which is probably a mistake because they couldn't learn lessons from how the British Queen performed. She was significantly larger, making that big step up again. Twice the tonnage of the Cunard ships that were being very successful at this time. She was the first ship with 3 decks. Her hull was the same shape as the British Queen, but she just had an extra deck on top, which made the ship very unstable with a tendency to roll. And in fact, when she was first released from the dock in London and set off for Liverpool, which was where she was going to have to sail around to Liverpool to have the engines fitted, she rolled over, the mast snapped. Another steamer came along from a competing line and had to tow her to Portsmouth, where the masts were sent after they were repaired and refitted. So that was a bit humiliating start to life. And her service history was very troubled as well once she did finally start working. So she was in Liverpool getting her engines fitted, and so they decided to switch the route to Liverpool to New York. Maiden voyage was in August of 1840, and induced the painting of this. This is by a very famous maritime painter called Samuel Walters. That's there she is, leaving Liverpool. Her first round trip was very, very slow, and when he got back to Liverpool, the captain was fired. Her second round trip was very, very slow, and when they got back to Liverpool, the captain was fired. The third round trip began in March of 1841, and the captain could only wish that he did get back to Liverpool. He should have been more worried about his life than his career, because unfortunately, she disappeared with all on board. 30 passengers and 106 crew. And this is a lithograph, a painting, which was in the publicity for this talk. The last ship to see her alive, a sailing ship had sailed alongside her in the first few days of her journey for New York. Horrible weather, horrible storm. The captain of that sailing ship, at an inquest in New York held at the British consulate, reported how she'd been pitching heavily, struggling, just not managing in the sea. So the general assumption is that she went down there, just about on George's Bank, having rounded Cape Cod and Nantucket and Cape Cod. And the British Queen was then sold to the Belgian government, and this company was out of business too. So we now had the Great Western sailing half the year and the Cunard Line. So the Cunard Line was the clear leader by this point. Absolutely superb operationally. It faced fines if it was ever late. I think it had one fine in the first 10 years. Service bi-weekly most of the year, monthly in winter. Between 1840 and 1845, made 110 round trips. That's all the way around the year, with an average of 14.8 days to cross, and that includes the necessarily slower crossings in winter. Initially lost money, but Cunard went to the Admiralty and said, this is costing a lot more to operate than either you or I anticipated. I need a higher compensation, which the government gave him. They're very happy to do that because they were making money from the postage on the mail he was carrying. So in 1848, he doubled the size of his fleet. And unlike all the other posts, this was actually his second upgrade of his fleet, and each time he just made an incremental increase in size from the previous version. He didn't do these massive steps from, say, 1,450 to 3,300 tons. This enabled him to do weekly sailings most of the year and bi-weekly in winter. But by far the most significant thing was that the US terminus now alternated between Boston and New York. So for the first time, you had a really competent operator sending steamships between Liverpool and New York, and that essentially was the kiss of death for the sailing packets. From this point forward, they lost all of the valuable freight and all of the highest paying passengers to the Cunard Line. He had an impeccable safety record, apart from one instance. So the Columbia was one of his original 4 steamers and would have gladdened his heart when in 1841 broke the Great Western's westbound speed record, which is called the Blue Ribbon, and so that was very pleasing. But 2 years later, went aground off Seal Island in fog, a friend or a foe we're going to hear a lot about. If you wonder where Seal Island is, there it is, at the southern tip of Nova Scotia. And there were no press photographers in those days. Weekly news magazines would send artists to go and sketch what they saw. And this is what happened to the Columbia in the fog. She had basically hit an underground ledge and then carried on right up it until she was completely out of the water and couldn't get back in again. But in the background, you'll see Seal Island. That meant that the lighthouse keeper there and people who lived on that island and local fishermen were able to come to the rescue and take all the passengers and crew off before the ship broke up under wave action. And that meant that no lives were lost. And the pilot was initially blamed because he's supposed to be able to keep them away from obstacles like that. But then there were multiple reports in the newspapers of other captains having been in the same area at the same time and all being way off the course where they thought they were because of a freak current. The most amazing thing about the Cunard Line, though, is after this accident, they did not lose a single passenger or another ship until a German U-boat sank the Lusitania in 1915. So they had an impeccable safety record. And that, of course, was very important to people because a lot of the other people were having less than stellar safety. They set records. So I mentioned the Columbia. And then after the Great Western came back briefly with her record, the Cunard Line was taking them all. The last 2 ships on the list here, there are images of. This is the Europa, which is, again, a very early photograph of a steamship. You don't get a good impression of the size because it's foreshortened when you take a photograph from the bow, although I think it probably doesn't look anything like what you would normally think of as an ocean liner. You get a better sense of the size from the next, which is a painting of a sister ship which was taken from the side. So the Cunard Line was doing very well. And by this point, you might be wondering when an American will get mentioned. Well, I'm now about to get involved in the involvement of the Americans, and that will enable me to talk about 3 different people from Cape Cod. So this is the Tales of Cape Cod, so we should have some Cape Codders in it. So where were they? Well, the first one to get involved was one of the Cape Codders. His name was Edward Knight Collins, normally just called E.K. Collins. He was born in 1802 in Truro, and his father operated an import-export firm in New York. So he moved down to New York in 1821 and proved himself to be quite the entrepreneur when it came to packet ships. So he started a packet line in 1827, going down to Mexico. He had bought one that already was up and running in 1831 that went between New York and New Orleans. And then in 1836, he started a completely new line called the Dramatic Line that quickly became New York's premier packet line, even though it was one of the last to get founded. And his trick was he was willing to invest very, very heavily to build ships that were bigger, faster, more luxurious than his competitors. And so he was the premium packet ship operator in New York within a couple of years of starting this line. But despite that success, he was also the first of the packet line owners in New York to realize steam was going to make sailing packets obsolete. And even though he was one of the first people to realize that, most of the other packet ship owners were very complacent because when they saw the smoking tea kettles, as they call them, they thought there was no way they would ever displace their beautiful, elegant ships. Well, they were wrong, of course. So E.K. Collins, because he recognized the importance of steam, in 1841 began lobbying Congress for a contract that would mirror the one that Cunard had. And nobody listened. So he actually directly wrote to the president, no reply. Not much happened for several years afterwards. There was one internal change he made, though, which is important. He appointed a new captain to Roscius. Roscius was a Roman actor, by the way. That was what the ship was named after. That gentleman, as another Cape Codder, you may recognize his photograph. His name was Asa Eldridge. He was born in Yarmouth Port in 1809, and the next two bullet points are in gray because there's speculation on my part based on the research I did for my book about him. But I think he began as a cook on Ansel Hallett's packet that went to and from Yarmouth and Boston. Ansel Hallett was his uncle and lived just around the corner. He had an older brother, John, 11 years older, who was the captain of a ship, America, and I believe that Asa then transferred to that ship to train because in 1829, he became the captain of the America. He showed early on in his career that he was capable of sailing very fast. He set a new record from Boston to Calcutta in 1833 that stood for 20 years until the clipper ship era started. He then moved on to various vessels trading with the Far East. He got married fairly recently. I think being away that long didn't really suit them as a couple. So in 1841, he transferred to a slightly shorter route, sailing from Boston down to a cotton port, to Liverpool with cotton, selling that, bringing back fancy goods that could be sold in Boston. And then finally, in 1844, he'd reached what was then regarded as the pinnacle of the sailing sea captain profession, which was to be the captain of a transatlantic packet ship, in his case, in the most highly regarded of all the packet lines. The following year, we finally had some action from the US government. So the Postmaster General solicited bids for mail service across the Atlantic in much the same way that the British Admiralty had 7 years earlier. Congress the following year awarded the first contract. It did not go to Collins. It went to a weird entity called the Ocean Steam Navigation Company. It was operated by people with no experience of shipping, transatlantic shipping, and it was on a route, which I'm not saying it's unimportant, but it was not going to do any threat at all to the Cunard line between New York and Liverpool. It was to Bremen in Germany, stopping in Cowes, which is on the south coast, the Isle of Wight in England. And once two steamers were running, this company would have the option to also sail to Le Havre in France. A late bid coming in from Collins was completely ignored. He wanted to sail between New York and Liverpool, the most important route, but his submission was ignored. So if we look at those routes, you can see how they were, I'm sure, important for the trade involved. Bremen is over. This is Bremerhaven, which links to Bremen by a river. The ships from New York were going to come across, stopping Cowes, which is just about there on the Isle of Wight, go there, and once they had 2 ships running, they would also be able to sail to Le Havre, down here, which was the nearest French port to Paris. That was the route they were given. As I say, no particular threat to the dominant route across the Atlantic. They made things worse by building 2 ships that were regarded by the maritime experts as ugly, slow, and they were definitely unreliable. The first was called the Washington. They're all a little bit bigger than the first generation we talked about earlier. This one's bigger still, the Herman. But having 2 lousy ships on a relatively unimportant route did nothing to bring the US into competition with the British steamship line. The following year, though, Collins was actually given the contract. He'd been denied in 1846, the year before. The problem that the original submission had, and which was a constant issue for him during the time of the operation of this Collins line, was opposition from the South and the West. Southern congressmen and senators did not want to have money go to rich New York merchants who were taking some of the profits of from the cotton they were growing. And the congresspeople from the West were only interested in having any government money that was being spent on commerce go into the infrastructure for the West. But there were some clever people who were Collins' allies who managed to do some finagling and get the approval through Congress. That led him to sell his packet line because he needed the capital to build some steamers. Asa Eldridge left when that happened to start his own steamship company called the Pioneer Line, but he didn't stay very long because his partners decided, after just 1 round trip to Liverpool, to divert that steamship all the way down around the Cape Horn and up to the Pacific side, because the gold rush was in progress at this point, and people needed steamers to shuttle up and down that coast. Interestingly enough, a third Eldridge comes into the story. Asa's younger brother, Oliver, 9 years younger than he took over the captaincy of the Roscias when Asa resigned. In the meantime, Collins, with his contract, was able to raise capital to build 4 huge, highly luxurious steamers, called this time after oceans, not actors, Atlantic, Pacific, Arctic, Baltic, and they all made their debut in 1850 in the sequence I just mentioned. So the one I'm going to focus on most is the one called the Pacific. The 4 were virtually identical. You couldn't tell them apart. So the interesting thing about the Pacific is it brings us to our third Cape Codder, Ezra Nye. Ezra Nye was born in Sandwich in 1798. He was the 3rd great-grandson, in other words, the great-great-grandson of Benjamin Nye, whose house is still around and is a museum in Sandwich. There is the house. He had a fairly typical career for sea captains of this period. So he started on relatively small ships, schooners. He took a break to get married. He came back, and he was now the captain of a packet ship going between Liverpool and between Boston and Liverpool rather than New York. So the lesser line, actually the lesser route. In 1832, he actually got the captaincy of a ship sailing to London from New York. The big one, of course, was to get one that was sailing to Liverpool. And in fact, he spent 14 years as the captain of the Independence and the Henry Clay, finally making it as the first captain of the Pacific of the Collins Line. And the Pacific did Nye and the Collins Line proud, or vice versa. As you can see here, the Pacific broke the record, the westbound record for speed across the Atlantic just a few months after she made her first voyage, and then early the following spring did the same for the eastbound. So you can also see that the Collins Line took over all the records from the Cunard Line, which of course was very pleasing for the American public. There was a lot of attention paid by the public to the exploits of these steamship lines. The Collins Line, though, was not the only new steamship line to hit the Atlantic in 1850. There were 2 others. One was an American company, and the other was a British company. So let's talk about the American company first. It was called the New York and Harbor Steamship Company, a steam navigation company, which I will call the NYH for short. And it came into existence because the OSNC had failed to implement the harbor route. And so that route was assigned to this new company. And unlike the people who started the OSNC, these owners had long experience with sailing packets on the same route. So they knew what they were doing. They acquired a partially built steamship from the OSNC, modified its design and completed it. And they commissioned a brand new ship, the Franklin. So they had two now ships going between New York and Le Havre. Their maiden voyages were in 1850 and 51, and the maritime press was impressed. They were decent performers. They were close in performance to the Cunard and the Collins line, and now and again they actually beat them. So they were doing pretty well. Unfortunately, they were also unlucky. So here are those two ships, the Humboldt and the Franklin. And the Humboldt broke up after running aground in fog off Halifax in November of 1853. There's a pilot in the story again, this time a bogus pilot. He was a fisherman who represented himself as being a pilot when the ship was approaching Halifax, and he wasn't a pilot. He didn't know where all the hidden rocks were, and the ship ran right onto one of them, and it broke up after it ran aground. The Franklin actually went a lot further before running aground. They were both coming from Liverpool, from Le Havre rather. It broke up after running aground in fog off Long Island in July of 1854. Now, the lucky thing for the steamship company, the NYH, was that by this point, New York shipyards was churning out steamers to go to the Pacific coast and go up and down that coast, which had become very busy after the gold rush and the massive growth in San Francisco. So there were two steamers that had just been completed, which they were able to charter for their operation to Havre. The second one there, the St. Louis, is going to figure again briefly in the story in just a minute. If we map again where those ships went down, so one of them was in Halifax and the other one was down in Long Island. You can see a pattern here. They're all along this coast. The second company that came into existence in 1850 was called the Inman Line, and this was a British one. It was formed by a Liverpool company buying a steamer that had originally been built to go between Glasgow and New York. And they initiated service between Liverpool and Philadelphia at the end of 1850. And this was actually a smart move because they're not competing directly with the Cunard line or the Collins line. They've got the route to themselves. Another innovation, this was the first company to have a propeller-driven steamer with an iron hull. One of the tricks they did is they recognized they were not going to be able to compete with the Cunard line because that had a mail contract which gave it the ability to run at a loss, what might otherwise be a loss, but they had the government subsidy helping them out. This company equipped ships with very modest engines, which made them a few days slower than the Cunard line, but they burnt a lot less coal, and so the company could make money even though it was not as quick. And it did that partly by avoiding competing on the same route. It was also the first company to carry steerage passengers on a steamship across the Atlantic. This is an artist's impression of the arrival of the first time it came into Philadelphia in 1850. Sadly, though, in March of 1854, sailing to Philadelphia from Liverpool, this one disappeared as well. Nobody knows where. 404 passengers, 76 crew were lost. Now, unlike the American company that had turned to those Pacific steamers, this company already had a steamer that was almost complete, which had been built in to expand its operations, but became instead the replacement ship for the one they'd just lost. And it sailed from Liverpool for Philadelphia at the end of August in 1854, and would you believe, a week later, ran aground off Cape Race in fog. Is this sounding familiar? No lives were lost, but the ship was completely lost, brand new ship lost. Cape Race, if you're wondering where it is up there on the southern tip of Newfoundland. Excuse me 1 second. So if you ever go sailing, avoid that coastline, particularly when there's fog around. And that star came down too quickly. Amazingly enough, just 3 weeks after the city of Philadelphia had been wrecked off Cape Race, another steamer was wrecked very close to where she had been wrecked. In fact, the survivors from these were arriving mixed together on the boats that had gone to help. And this was a Collins liner, the Arctic. So she collided with a small steamer in fog near Cape Race at the end of September, as I say, just 3 weeks after the other disaster I just described. And to begin with, the captain thought he'd damaged the small steamer far more than his ship had been damaged. But that turned out to be wrong. The other steamer was certainly damaged, but there was a big gash down the side of the Arctic, which immediately began filling with water. And there was complete pandemonium when people realized it was sinking. In particular, the people in the who were looking after the engines, the stokers and so on, they completely panicked because they could see the water rising up around their legs. And what they did was actually unforgivable in terms of maritime behavior. So they burst out of the engine room, pushed aside all the passengers, and took precedence for the lifeboats. And you can see the sort of pandemonium there was on the ship when they realized it was sinking, all the people going up there trying to get away from the side that was going into the water first. As I said, the crew took the lifeboats ahead of the passengers, and that behavior was reflected in the death toll. So 92% of the passengers were in a death toll of 350, but only 60% of the crew. That death toll of 350 included every single woman and child on board. And tragically for Collins, he not only lost a ship, he lost a lot of his family. So his wife, 2 of his 3 children, and a brother and a sister-in-law were all lost. Now, as you can imagine, there was a major scandal about this whole episode. There was a grand jury investigation, particularly into the behavior of the crew. Unfortunately, no indictments were issued. All that happened was lifeboat recommendations were issued for having more lifeboats on the ship, enough for every passenger on board. But as we know from the Titanic many years later, that was never actually fully implemented. So if you just think back over what I've said in the last few minutes, it turns out this was an absolutely catastrophic year for the steamship industry. In the space of an 11-month period, 5 ships had been lost. And a common theme for those losses was fog. And in fact, you can see the ones which were lost in fog, and who's to say that the city of Glasgow did not also go get lost as a result of fog too. The most amazing thing in all of this is the one line that escaped unscathed was the Cunard line. This must be by luck, not necessarily by judgment in this case. So what happened next? Well, the Collins line came under major financial pressure. Like the Cunard line, it faced penalties if it didn't keep to the schedule, and it was finding great difficulty maintaining that with only 3 steamers instead of 4. And when it had doubled service back in 1852, its mail contract had been increased by 473,000 to a figure of 858,000. You multiply that by 35 to get to modern dollars, by the way. But the Southern Congress people insisted, as a condition of that, agreeing to that, that the extra money that had been given would be cancelable on 6 months' notice after January the 1st, 1855. And this accident happened just 3 months before that. Now, possibly out of sympathy for Collins' personal losses, Congress did agree to carry on funding it at the full rate in 1855. So Collins went ahead and commissioned another steamer called the Adriatic. So he was hoping to get back up to 4 steamers again and avoid this stress of trying to keep to the schedule. One other thing happened in 1855 that had nothing to do with everything I've just said, which is that Ezra Nye retired from the Pacific as its captain, and he was replaced by our friend Asa Eldridge. So what had Eldridge been doing since the Pioneer Line, which he'd started and quickly left? Well, in the summer of 1853, Cornelius Vanderbilt had chosen Eldridge to be his captain to take a group of 20 people, Vanderbilt's family and his closest friends, on a 4-month tour around Europe in Vanderbilt's private steam yacht. So whatever vision you have in your head when I say private steam yacht, it's probably not this. It was actually one of the biggest steamships in the world, and he later put it into service as an ocean liner. And so Eldridge spent the summer of 1853 cruising around Europe in that with the Vanderbilts. In 1854, at the beginning of the year, he did the thing he's most famous for. He captained a clipper ship, brand new, on a maiden voyage from New York to Liverpool, and set an all-time record for the crossing of the Atlantic by a sailing ship, which has never been beaten, still stands today. He came back from that, was looking for a steamship to be the captain of. Most of them, the captains were not leaving. It was a very privileged position. In August of 1854, you remember, the NYH had lost the Herman. It had chartered the St. Louis, and Eldridge became the St. Louis's captain. He only ever did one round trip in her, though. I think the reason for that, again, this is speculation on my part, he got back to from that round trip, and the first thing he heard about was the Arctic disaster. Now, he'd known E.K. Collins for a long time, and Collins was so distraught at the loss of his family, he retired to his estate on Long Island and was not seen around. So it's my belief that what Eldridge did here was step out of his own career to help Collins get through this period, which is why he was rewarded at the end of 1855 with the captaincy of the Pacific. So how did he do? Well, he made a respectable first round trip in December of 1855. The next one, worst month of the year, he's going to be sailing in January, a round trip to Liverpool from New York. When they reached Liverpool, the chief engineer sent a letter back to headquarters in New York in which he described that crossing as taking place in the worst weather he'd ever seen. And on the return leg, there was a lot of pressure on both the Pacific and Eldridge because there was a brand new steamer from the Cunard line going to be following them just 3 days after they left Liverpool. And this brand new steamer from the Cunard line was a behemoth. I told you Cunard believed in incremental improvements, but because of the performance of the Collins line, he decided to go wild, to go big for this upgrade. So this went up to 3,600 tons with the same horsepower as that. And there was a lot of speculation in the maritime community and the press, even though the Pacific was going to leave 3 days earlier, was the Persia going to catch it and overtake it on the Atlantic? Well, the Persia was the first to reach New York in 14 days, not particularly fast time. She'd been damaged by ice. She rammed an iceberg, and one of her paddle wheels was damaged by ice as well. That meant people were watching out with the Pacific with a lot of anxiety. After weeks of agonized waiting and hoping for the Pacific to appear, she never did. So all aboard were lost, 45 passengers and 141 crew. Now, there was a lot of, the consensus at the time was it's been steaming hard to stay ahead of the Persia, hit ice in fog, and sunk. There's a lot of controversy, though, not only at the time, but a lot later, too. So Ezra Nye, who we talked about, the previous captain, started this controversy and himself got into hot water for doing so. He sent a letter to the newspaper implying that the loss was, even before people had given up on the Pacific, was due to a lot of crew turnover because the captaincy had gone to Asa rather than to Oliver Eldridge. Ezra Nye had been cultivating Oliver to be the next captain, but then Collins gave the captaincy to Asa. And Nye said a lot of the crew left because of that. Turns out not to be true. He also said the new chief engineer on the Pacific had no relevant experience. The guy had been the deputy chief engineer for 3 years on another Collins liner, and he'd been on US Navy steamers for 10 years before that. So although neither of these were true, that did seed doubts into the historical record. And if you look at accounts of the loss, you'll see that even being said that Eldridge himself didn't have enough experience to be in charge of this steamship. This was his fourth steamship. He'd had the Pioneer, then the Vanderbilt ship, then the St. Louis, and then this. And he had far more experience than Nye himself had when he became the captain of the Pacific. The other controversy emerged a lot later, 136 years later, to be honest. So in 1992, a wreck was found off the coast of Wales and was identified as the Pacific. Now, the information about this discovery appeared in a maritime journal, which I've read the article. I thought the evidence was very, very flimsy, and in fact, it was wrong. So when divers went back to the wreck a few years later, they started bringing up steel plates that had the date 1864 or 1865 stamped on them. Since the Pacific sank in 1856, this could not be the Pacific. So the original view is probably the right view. It was supported by a message in a bottle that was found in the Hebrides in 1860. Now, there were always hoaxes with messages in bottles whenever a ship went down, but no less an authority than the Times of London and the leading maritime journal in the UK validated this as being an authentic message in the bottle from a member of the crew as the ship went down. So that appears to be what actually happened. In the aftermath, the Collins Line collapsed just a couple of years later. So I told you the mail contract was always in jeopardy of having the extra had been awarded in 52 cut back. Well, that happened. It cut back actually right away. The next time Congress had to renew the contract, they cut it back. And then it was not renewed at all. The OSNC and the NYH, their contracts didn't get renewed either. And then came the Civil War, followed by Reconstruction, and the US had zero interest in trying to compete in transatlantic steamships, which left the Atlantic to the British lines. And in fact, if you look, the same was true eastbound, but here's the westbound record for the next 45 years. You can see there at the top, the Baltic was still the record holder. The Persia did turn out to be very fast, took the record straight away, all the way down to 1898 before a German liner took the record. And in between, it was swapped between various British lines. So the US was just not interested. It was a better period in many ways for steamships than the one I talked about. I've been describing 8 disasters that took place in the first 18 years of operation. In the next 50-odd years, 45 years, there were only 8 disasters too. And some of them were just due to inane human error. So, but 5 of them are pretty much the same sort of thing that we've been talking about. Disappeared en route, ran aground, hit a rock in fog, disappeared, hit a rock in fog. This one collided with a sailing ship and fog. So that coastline turns out to have been very, very dangerous, which leads me to reflections about what we can learn from looking at this history. The first thing to recognize, I think, is that early transatlantic steamers were experiments. Nobody had ever been able to build a ship that was capable of going all the way across the Atlantic powered by a steam engine. So they having to figure out as they went along how to do that. Many of the early ones were underpowered for the size of them. Some of the companies made major mistakes of trying to do massive jumps from the first ship to the second to the third. And in many cases, the builders didn't have appropriate experience to be building steamships or steamship engines, and that also contributed. None of those things were true of the Cunard line, where he went to the best builders in the world of steamships, built multiple ships of identical design, and then went just gradually, step by step, until he went big for the Persia. And so the builders and the operators were highly experienced. The same was true of Collins. He'd been operating packet lines for 30 years before he operated a steamship line. He also built near-identical ships and took on experienced captains. His mistake was that he didn't realize how much it was going to cost to operate the bigger, better, faster models that he went for as he had in his packet line. These needed coal. The wind was free. The packet line could sail without any fuel expense. The fuel expense for the Collins Line steamers, they were the fastest, but they also ate through coal far more quickly than anybody else. And because of that, it made him very vulnerable to regional tensions in Congress. The Southern and the Western Congress people were all the time looking for a reason to cut his subsidy, and eventually they did. But overall, though, if we stand back from the big picture and ask the big picture question, the biggest problem that these people faced was the demand for speed was higher on the route they were operating than any other route worldwide. It was the busiest trade route with the highest profile. There was a constant fierce battle to get the high-paying passengers and cargo, and there were matters of national pride. Again, if you see the reports in the newspapers at the time of when the Collins liner was breaking records, people really related to this. Now, if you're going to go as fast as possible, you're going to take the shortest route. And unfortunately, as we've seen, that shortest route passed through very hazardous waters. A fog-prone coastline, which at times of the year had icebergs and ice fields to contend with as well. So you mix high speeds and dangerous waters, and you're going to have disasters. And you saw that in the stories I've been telling, all these disasters that took along this place. The only one which was not related to fog, but was related to a terrible storm, was the president. And who's to say that the two we don't know about, the Pacific and the city of Glasgow, were not also caused because of fog along this coastline. In total, 1,152 lives were lost in these disasters, which is getting close to the ballpark of the 1,512 in the Titanic disaster. If you add in the ones I talked about in the second 50 years, which I just showed a brief table about, then that number becomes 3,523, so significantly more than the Titanic disaster, although I dare say most people in the public have never heard of any of these disasters, and there were 4 more which were in fog along this coastline. So that sounds like a terrible price to pay, but what these transatlantic steamers did was make this possible. So this is a chart showing the number of immigrants entering the US from Europe every year from 1870, which is probably the time when steamships became the preferred way for all passengers to get across the Atlantic, until 1960, which is when jet planes started to take over all the transatlantic passenger trade. And if you add up all the numbers, in this period, 28.2 million people moved from Europe to live in the US, and the vast majority of them came on transatlantic steamships. So I think we can say the transatlantic liners played a huge role in US history, and I think that, no disrespect, but I think our generation, if I can call us that, we probably remember the fact that the transat liners were so important. The people who watched Titanic got one reminder, thank you, James Cameron. But I think a lot of the younger people today have no sense at all of just how important these ships were to the building of the US, both for bringing immigrants here and for all the trade that they conducted. My final thought. Thank you. Happy to take any questions. Not to my knowledge. The ones that disappeared, I think people have no idea what happened to them. They just never showed up.
Who was financing this risky business of building it in the first place? And where were the insurance companies? Were they active at all?
So, those are great questions. Okay, second question, yes, insurance companies were active. So although Collins lost, for example, the Pacific and the Arctic, those would have been insured, not necessarily to the full amount, but he would have got a good amount of money back from the insurance companies. The original capital was sold by what we would call IPOs. So the original capital for a lot of these companies was, there was no SEC, there was no common stock market. So for example, when the B&A got organized, the New York legislature, although there was an American branch as well as a British branch, the New York legislature had to pass a piece of legislation in order to allow that company to sell stock to the public. That was how it was done. That was the way the Collins line did it too.
I noticed in the pictures they have the sails up and the smokestacks.
Yeah.
Did they use them both at the same time?
They did, yeah. Because if the wind was behind, then they could obviously reduce the consumption of coal by taking advantage of the wind. The idea that Brunel had for the Great Britain was she had 6 masts. She was going to carry more sail than most sailing ships did, and that would enable her, for example, to do longer hauls than were possible just on coal alone.
Why didn't they ever consider a route avoiding the fogs and the icebergs? Why didn't they go across and then up?
It's deceptive when you look at a 2-dimensional representation of the routes across the Atlantic. If you get a globe out and take a piece of string and go from the UK to the US to the ports they were doing, the shortest route takes you along that coast. They could have gone further south, but that would mean they would be taking longer, which would, number one, cost them more, but number two, the amount of attention they paid to their sailing times was huge. So to be competitive, you had to be as fast as everybody else. The Cunard line is owned by Carnival. It is, to this day, it still operates the only remaining liner in the world. The Queen Mary II operates as a scheduled ocean liner, not as a cruise ship. When jet planes came along, the steamers that were still active at that time, most of them turned into cruise ships or were just retired. But the Queen Mary II still operates as a liner. It costs you a lot of money, but it operates as a liner.
When you said there was an existing sailing record, it still exists. How many days did that take?
I'm sorry?
The record that Asa Eldridge.
Oh, his record sailing from that clipper ship went from New York to Liverpool in, 13 days, 12 hours and 25. I used to know it off by heart a long time. So I've got a book over there, I'll look it up. It was just over 12 days.
Was Belfast ever involved in manufacturing?
Yes. I don't know whether at what point they became involved. So when I was growing up as a kid in Liverpool, the main shipbuilding centres in the UK were Belfast and Camberlades in Birkenhead, which is across the Mersey from Liverpool. Nope. I've taken ferries across the Mersey. That's about the limit. And actually, a ferry across the English Channel as well. Oh, you have? Oh, and how was that? That's great. My wife and I attended a presentation at the Yarmouth Library last year where there was a guy who traveled on several of the ocean liners giving a talk. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for coming. If anybody's interested, I do have books about Asa Eldridge and about a transatlantic shipping line that involves clipper ships.